Hello. Have you ever felt a chill down your spine while passing through a familiar place, as if someone was watching you? Welcome to Secret, where the most spine-chilling and haunting ghost stories await. Tonight, we'll take you into a dark world with 4 terrifying tales that you'll never forget. Do you have the courage to listen until the very end? Story 1. The Shadowed One, Waverly Hills Sanatorium. A renowned name in the field of paranormal research. It all began as a secluded tuberculosis hospital, where thousands of patients passed the boundary between life and death in agony. However, not every soul departed with its body, and in the dark corners of the building, spirits lingered in a different form, the Shadowed One. Madison, a paranormal investigator, decided to venture into this place, partly to uncover the truth, partly driven by an insatiable curiosity. She brought along a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook for recording chilling encounters. From the moment she stepped through the iron gate into the grounds of Waverly Hills, Madison felt something was profoundly wrong. A biting chill enveloped the air, and every step she took was filled with an unexplainable unease. Yet for Madison, this was only the beginning. In the long, dim hallways of the 5th floor, rumored to be where many patients ended their lives to escape unbearable pain, Madison searched for mysteries. She swept her flashlight back and forth, but the darkness consumed parts of the light, creating the sense that the beam could only scratch the surface of an empty void. "Who's there?" Madison called out when she saw a shadow flicker in her peripheral vision. She pointed her flashlight toward it, but all that greeted her was a more oppressive darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest. "I must be imagining things," she whispered to herself. However, as she took another step, that shadow suddenly appeared right in front of her. Madison sometimes thought it wasn't just a shape, but a presence that pressed upon her. "They're watching me," Madison thought tremblingly. The longer Madison stayed in the building, the clearer she saw the shadowed ones. At first, they were just faint figures flitting past her vision. But gradually, she began to see them standing there, motionless, like lifeless structures amidst the darkness. They had no eyes, yet Madison could feel their gaze fixed on her. Each step she took closer made the shadows loom larger. Breathing heavily, she abandoned all her research equipment and ran down the hallway. Every day after returning home, Madison couldn't shake the shadows. She recalled a curse mentioned in the notes. Those who see them will never escape. And then, in every dark corner of her house, she began to see shadowy figures waiting. They didn't move, but Madison felt they were becoming a part of her. An itch in her mind and whispers echoed, "Come back to us." Madison couldn't escape her fear. Every night, she found herself wandering her house. But in the mirror, there was only a faint, shadowy reflection. Until one day, when Madison suddenly opened her eyes, she realized that in the mirror this time, there was no shadow. Only a lifeless Madison staring back. Madison disappeared mysteriously. Occasionally, in the dark corners of the house, neighbors heard whispers. "Whoever sees me will become me. Be careful when looking into the dark corners. Who knows if the shadow behind you is already watching?" The Story 2. The Game of Two Selves. Emma, a gentle and soft-spoken girl, always had a mysterious gleam in her eyes. She lived in a small apartment in Madison City. Each day passed uneventfully with mundane tasks, until one day, something in her mind changed. When Emma slept, she began to hear whispers. At first, they were faint, vague words, soft like a breeze passing by. She thought it was normal, but then the whispers grew clearer, as if someone was right next to her ear. "Emma?" She startled awake, opening her eyes. The room was completely empty, yet the feeling of being watched lingered. Even so, Emma brushed it off, convincing herself it was just stress playing tricks on her. But the whispers didn't stop. Day by day, the voice in Emma's head became louder and clearer. Finally, it spoke distinctly. I am Ava. I am a part of you. At first, Emma was horrified. Ava wasn't just a dream or a hallucination. It knew everything about Emma. Her deepest fears, her darkest memories, and thoughts she herself didn't dare confront. Why are you afraid? Ava whispered. We can share the same fate, the same body, but whoever is stronger will take it all. Emma panicked. She sought help from doctors, but Ava manipulated her to say misleading things. When Emma tried to document her thoughts, her hand began writing words that weren't hers. I thrive on your pain, and you, what can you do? The next day, Emma's apartment was found in disarray. The mirror shattered, the walls scratched, and Emma's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor. But upon examination, there was no trace of Ava. People assumed Emma had succumbed to her deteriorating mental state. But one day, in a shadowy corner of a psychiatric ward, a nurse heard a familiar whisper. Let's play this game. Are you ready? Story 3. Whispers from the Shadows. The name Whisper Men began as a legend shared around campfires in the small town of Ravenwood, located in Maine. No one knows exactly where the legend originated, but everyone agrees. Anyone who hears their whispers never returns to being themselves. Will Baker, a freelance journalist specializing in strange stories, heard about the Whisper Men through a post on an urban legends forum. Imagine walking through the woods and hearing a faint sound that becomes a whisper. At first, it's almost inviting. Then you realize it's calling your name. Will, who never shied away from bizarre tales, decided to travel to Ravenwood to investigate. Ravenwood was a dreary town shrouded in thick fog. Its old wooden buildings were riddled with moss, and its people were filled with unease. When Will asked about the Whisper Men in a cafe, an elderly woman, upon hearing his question, immediately dropped what she was holding. You shouldn't ask about them. The Whisper Men don't like being mentioned. Yet, Will's curiosity only grew. Over the course of a week, he heard stories about them. Tall, gaunt figures with featureless faces, no eyes, only wide mouths stretching ear to ear. Anyone who heard them was said to never return to normal. One night, Will decided to venture into the Ravenwood forest himself. The moon was obscured by dark clouds, and the dense fog made the scenery eerie and otherworldly. At first, the forest was unnaturally silent. Then, Will heard it. Will. The voice was soft, like a faint breeze. He froze, his heart pounding. Who was it? Who was calling his name? Will, come closer. Compelled by his overwhelming curiosity, he ventured further. But with each step, he realized something was wrong. The whispers grew clearer. They weren't just sounds. They felt like invisible hands gripping his will, crushing his thoughts. When Will looked up, he saw them. Tall figures surrounded him in the fog. Their faces were pale, eyeless, but their mouths gaped wide, emitting whispers that poured into Will's ears. You've heard us. You cannot return. Will tried to run, but the whispers clung to him like shadows. They unveiled his deepest fears, his hidden regrets and pain. He screamed, "Please, spare me." The next day, the townspeople found Will unconscious at the forest's edge. Though still breathing, his eyes were vacant, and his mouth hung open as if caught mid-scream. When taken to the hospital, he began muttering unintelligible words. They're coming. They're coming. After that, no one saw Will again. His room remained eerily silent, but at night, hospital staff swore they heard whispers. When they turned on the lights, all they found were faint handprints, cold and ghostly. A week later, the whispers began in another part of town. This time, it was the townspeople. Each time the whispers were heard, people vanished without a trace, silently. Will Baker, after regaining consciousness in the hospital, secretly records his experience, hoping to uncover the truth behind the Whispermen. His voice trembles in the recording, and his tale only deepens the listener's fear. They're not just shadows. They know your thoughts. They know things about you that even you wish to forget. They use them to torment you piece by piece. I saw a child crying. That child was me, and I heard my father's cruel laughter. The recording ends abruptly with a blood-curdling scream, followed by distant whispers. We're always here. The residents of Ravenwood seem to know all too well about the Whispermen, but refuse to speak of them out of fear. An elderly woman confides in Will during one of his return visits for clues. This town was once peaceful, but then the curious ones came, pulling the Whispermen out of the shadows. They're not ghosts, not humans. They're punishment. The story unravels details about a group of explorers who performed a forbidden ritual years ago. They vanished, but since then, the Whispermen emerged. The whispers no longer remain confined to the forest. They begin spreading throughout the town at night. At first, only a few hear them, but soon, the entire town is gripped with terror as people begin to vanish without a trace. The whispers now have a form. Dark silhouettes flickering outside windows, cold hands brushing against shoulders as residents sleep. By morning, another house stands empty, its inhabitants erased from memory. Will decides to face the Whispermen once more. This time, he brings a tape recorder and an oil lantern, hoping to capture the ultimate evidence. As he ventures deeper into the woods, the light from his lantern seems to be consumed, leaving him in near total darkness. The whispers do not delay. Will, we know you've returned. Do you think you can escape? The lantern extinguishes. In the suffocating darkness, there are only whispers, the crunch of footsteps, and Will's ragged breathing. Laughter echoes around him, driving him to scream in desperation. The story ends in ambiguity. The listener is left wondering if Will survived or became part of the shadows. However, his tape recorder is later found near the woods, with a scrawled message on its cover. They're always here, and they never stop. The story closes with a chilling warning. If you hear whispers in the dark, never respond. Don't seek them, and don't speak of them. The Whispermen don't like being named, but once they know about you, they will never let you go. The Story 4. The Crooked Man. Once upon a time, in a small village nestled deep in a shadowy valley, there lived a man whose name no one dared to mention. The villagers called him the Crooked Man, for everything about him was twisted and broken, a grotesque reflection of despair. The Crooked Man lived in a rickety wooden house, hidden deep within a dense forest. The house seemed consumed by darkness, with a sagging roof, shattered windows, and creaking doors that groaned with the wind. Children in the village feared the tales of his uneven footsteps and the faint, eerie glow of his lantern, always tilted as if it were about to fall. No one dared approach the house, for those who did would often return pale and shaken, claiming they felt a bone-chilling cold and the sensation of being watched by something lurking in the shadows. But the Crooked Man wasn't always like this. Once, he was a handsome young man who lived in the heart of the village. He loved a beautiful woman, and they were to be married. But fate had other plans. One fateful afternoon, while the couple was gathering wildflowers for their wedding, the woman slipped and fell into a deep ravine. Her final scream echoed through the valley, leaving the man shattered and hollow. After her death, he disappeared into the forest, retreating to the old, crumbling house. Villagers claimed they could hear sobbing coming from the house during rainy nights. But as time passed, the sobs turned into eerie, distorted laughter. Day by day, his body began to twist and contort, mirroring the anguish in his soul. He became the Crooked Man, a physical embodiment of sorrow and torment. Believing himself cursed, The crooked man decided to end his misery one stormy night. He tied a rope to a beam in his crooked house, but as he pulled the knot tight, the rope began to fray and twist as if mocking him. Suddenly, a cold, sinister laughter echoed from the darkness. He didn't die that night, but his body became completely deformed. Everything around him also changed. Chairs broke unevenly, mirrors warped to reflect monstrous images, and his lantern's light never shone straight again. His house became a grotesque place, where everything bent and twisted unnaturally, just like him. After the crooked man vanished, the villagers thought the nightmare was over. But soon, they began having strange dreams. A farmer dreamed of entering the rickety house where he saw the crooked man sitting at a table, his twisted face smiling eerily, his gaze piercing straight through the farmer's soul. A young girl dreamed of standing in front of a mirror, only to watch her reflection slowly bend and twist until her body became just as crooked as his. The dreams grew more vivid, more real. People woke up feeling aches in their bones, as though the curse had begun to spread to them. Some even noticed their own bodies starting to change, subtly at first, but undeniably. The curse seeped into the village. Mirrors began reflecting distorted images. Furniture warped for no reason. Even doors and windows bent unnaturally, as if pulled by some invisible force. One night, a man heard uneven footsteps outside his house. Peering through his window, he saw a faint, tilted glow, the lantern of the crooked man. He never dared to open the door. A group of brave young men from the village decided to confront their fear. Armed with torches and blades, they ventured into the forest. As they approached the house, the door creaked open, and a bone-chilling gust of wind swept over them. Inside, they saw furniture arranged in grotesque, unnatural shapes, as if mocking their courage. Then, the dim glow of the lantern appeared. The crooked man stood in the shadows, his twisted figure barely visible. His crooked smile stretched across his deformed face as he stared at them. One of the men charged forward, but the figure vanished, leaving only a cold, eerie laughter echoing through the trees. They say that once you've heard the tale of the crooked man, he will find his way into your dreams. If you see him, don't look into his eyes. But what good would that do? By the time you see him, it's already too late. Do you feel a chill creeping over you? Is there a dark corner in your room you haven't checked yet? Don't turn around. Don't look in the mirror tonight. But if you feel a cold breath on the back of your neck, then he's already here. Be careful. The crooked man never leaves. The story 5. The shadow lurking in dreams. Jake, a 27-year-old man, lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. His mundane office job made his days pass by in a dull haze. But recently, Jake had been plagued by strange dreams. In these dreams, he was relentlessly pursued by a shadowy figure, part human, part something else. Whenever he tried to get a clearer look at its face, the figure would vanish into thick, choking fog. The dreams grew increasingly vivid, blurring the line between reality and the surreal. Each time he woke up, Jake felt as though something unseen was watching him, lurking in the dark corners of his room. But when he turned on the lights, he found nothing, just the suffocating silence of the night. One night, after a particularly terrifying nightmare, Jake woke up with his heart racing. He couldn't recall the details of the dream, but a shadowy face lingered in his mind. A face that seemed eerily familiar, as though he'd seen it somewhere before. Determined to uncover the truth, Jake dug through old photos and journals from his childhood. In one faded photo taken at a park when he was 6 years old, Jake noticed a man standing in the background, partially obscured in the shadows. The man wore a black suit, his face tilted downward, but his piercing eyes seemed fixed on Jake. It was the same face from his dreams. A shiver ran down Jake's spine. He couldn't recall ever meeting this man, yet the image was hauntingly vivid. Why had this stranger appeared in his dreams? Was there some kind of connection between the nightmares and this eerie photograph? From the moment Jake discovered the photo, unsettling events began happening in his apartment. At first, it was faint noises, footsteps echoing in the dead of night. Then, objects in his home began to move inexplicably. One morning, Jake woke to find all the chairs in his kitchen turned upside down. The most chilling event happened one night when Jake was jolted awake by a scratching sound on his bedroom wall. He opened his eyes to see a long, distorted shadow hanging from the ceiling, its glowing red eyes staring directly at him. Jake screamed and switched on the light, but the shadow vanished, leaving behind deep claw marks etched into the wall. Terrified, Jake reached out to his old friend Mark, a paranormal enthusiast who had studied supernatural occurrences. Mark immediately agreed to help after hearing Jake's story, recognizing the signs from similar cases. Mark and Jake sought the help of Dr. Wilson, a dream researcher reputed for his expertise in unraveling bizarre dreams. Upon hearing Jake's account, Dr. Wilson's face turned pale. He recounted an ancient legend about entities that reside in human dreams, not figments of the imagination, but restless spirits trapped between realms. When someone sees them in a dream, it means they have found a way to cross into the waking world. Dr. Wilson explained that the man in the photo might be one such spirit. They don't let go of their prey. They latch onto your memories, making you recall them obsessively until your sense of reality is entirely eroded. In the nights that followed, Jake found himself unable to sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, the entity's face loomed closer, its features growing sharper and more menacing. Desperate, Mark and Jake set up a camera in Jake's room to capture what was happening while he slept. When they reviewed the footage, they were horrified. In the dead of night, Jake sat up in bed, his eyes empty and lifeless. He began whispering incomprehensible words as the shadowy figure emerged in the corner of the room. It crawled toward Jake but vanished the moment it touched him. Mark realized the entity was taking control of Jake. If they didn't act quickly, the spirit would completely consume him. Mark and Dr. Wilson decided to perform an ancient ritual to banish the spirit. They prepared a protective circle with candles and arcane symbols to shield Jake from harm. The ritual began at midnight, the time when the spirit's power was said to be weakest. As they chanted, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles extinguished themselves, and the shadow appeared, larger, more terrifying than ever. It lunged at Jake, but the protective circle held it back. Its deafening screams echoed through the room as Jake writhed in pain, clutching his head. Mark and Dr. Wilson continued the incantation, ignoring the entity's attempts to shatter the circle. Finally, with a loud, ear-piercing shriek, the shadow exploded into nothingness, leaving the room deathly silent. After the ritual, Jake felt an unexplainable relief. The nightmares ceased, and his life gradually returned to normal. But Mark remained cautious, knowing such entities rarely disappeared for good. Months later, Jake received an unmarked package in the mail. Inside was a photograph of his apartment taken in the dead of night. In the photo, the shadowy figure was back, lurking in the corner with its fiery red eyes. Scrawled across the back of the photo in jagged handwriting were the words, "I'm back. This time, no one can save you." Jake froze in terror, his gaze darting to the dark corner of his room, where the shadows began to writhe and twist, creeping ever closer. The Story 6. Final stop, the night was pitch black. Silence enveloped everything, and thick fog wrapped the deserted road like a suffocating blanket. John, a truck driver who had been driving for hours, felt exhausted. His route was long and lonely, cutting through a desolate rural area. He anxiously glanced at the fuel gauge as the needle edged closer to empty. He hadn't seen any vehicles pass by for hours, and there was no sign of the next gas station. When the engine sputtered and died, John cursed under his breath. He pulled the truck to the side of the road and stepped out. The cold night air bit into his skin as he looked around. In the distance, a faint, flickering light caught his attention. It came from a small building, barely visible through the hazy mist. John grabbed the flashlight from the cab and started walking toward the light. As he got closer, the outline of an old motel emerged. The sign hanging above the entrance flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the parking lot. The peeling paint read, "Final Stop Motel." The building looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, with broken windows and walls stained with the marks of time. But it was his only option. John pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The lobby was dimly lit, with a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The smell of mildew and rotting wood filled the air. A dusty reception desk sat in the corner, but there was no one behind it. "Hello?" John called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. Silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the flickering light. A long hallway stretched into the darkness, lined with faded wallpaper and old portraits hanging on the walls. One of the doors near the end of the corridor was slightly ajar, with a soft, warm glow spilling out from within. John hesitated. Something about the place felt off, but exhaustion and desperation pushed him forward. He approached the door and peeked inside. It was a modestly furnished room with a bed, a small table, and a single chair by the window. It looked surprisingly clean compared to the rest of the motel. "I guess this will do for the night," he muttered to himself. He stepped inside, shut the door, and dropped his bag on the floor. As he settled in, John's attention was drawn to the portraits hanging on the walls of the room. There were 4 of them, each depicting a different person. The faces in the paintings were strikingly detailed, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to follow him no matter where he stood. John chuckled nervously. Creepy artwork. Perfect. He turned away, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling of being watched. After a quick shower, he climbed into bed, hoping to get some rest. But as he lay there in the darkness, sleep eluded him. The silence of the room was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building. Every now and then, he thought he heard faint whispers, but when he strained to listen, there was nothing. Turning over, John glanced at the portraits again. In the dim light, the faces looked even more lifelike, their eyes almost glowing. He pulled the blanket over his head, telling himself it was just his imagination. Finally, John drifted into a restless sleep, but his dreams were filled with strange and unsettling images. He saw himself standing in the motel hallway, the portraits on the walls watching him with unblinking eyes. He tried to move, but his legs felt like they were weighed down by concrete. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, filling his ears with unintelligible words. Suddenly, one of the portraits came to life. The figure in the painting stepped out of the frame, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it crawled toward him. Its face twisted into a grotesque grin, and its eyes burned with a malevolent light. John screamed, but no sound came out. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The room was silent again, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. He looked at the portraits, half expecting them to move. They were still, but their eyes seemed even more intense than before. Unable to shake the feeling, John decided to leave the room. He needed air, needed to clear his head. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The hallway was darker than he remembered, and the flickering bulb cast long, shifting shadows. As he walked, he noticed something strange. The portraits on the walls were no longer the same. Instead of faces, they now showed scenes from his own life, moments he had forgotten or tried to bury. One painting showed him as a child, crying in his bedroom. Another depicted him arguing with his ex-wife. Each image was disturbingly vivid, as if the artist had been there, capturing every detail. Panic set in. He turned to go back to his room, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The door to his room was nowhere in sight. The whispers returned, louder this time, and he could feel something behind him, breathing down his neck. John turned slowly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Standing at the end of the hallway was a figure, tall and shadowy, its face hidden in darkness. It began to move toward him, its steps slow and deliberate. John ran. The hallway twisted and turned in impossible ways, leading him deeper into the motel. The portraits on the walls blurred together, their faces contorted in agony. Doors slammed shut as he passed, and the whispers grew deafening. After what felt like an eternity, John stumbled into a large room he hadn't seen before. It was filled with more portraits, but these were different. They were windows, looking out onto a strange, lifeless landscape. The sky was dark and filled with swirling clouds, and the ground was covered in jagged black rocks. In the distance, he could see figures moving, their shapes barely human. He realized with a sinking feeling that the portraits in his room had not been paintings. They had been windows, and the eyes watching him belonged to the inhabitants of that otherworldly place. He was not alone in the motel. He had never been alone. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and guttural. "You can't leave," it said. "This is your final stop." The shadowy figure appeared again, stepping through one of the windows. Its face was a horrifying amalgamation of the people he had seen in the portraits, their features fused together in a grotesque mask. John backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The figure reached out, its hand cold and clawed, and darkness consumed him. The next morning, the motel looked as it always did, abandoned and decaying. But if someone were to walk into the room John had stayed in, they would notice a new portrait on the wall. It showed a man, his face twisted in terror, staring out as if pleading for help. And if they looked closely, they might see his eyes move, following them as they walked by.